Welcome to A Soldier's Note channel. Before continuing to watch this video, don't forget to press the subscribe button, activate notifications, like, and share with your friends. Thank you.
US sale of F-16s to Taiwan may inflame China, but also keep Beijing at bay. Taipei, Taiwan. Taiwan's agreement this month to buy $8 billion worth of advanced F-16 fighter jets from the United States will prompt threats from China against the island and in turn spark more anti-China action by Washington, but eventually help keep Beijing at bay, experts say. U.S. President Donald Trump approved the sale a year ago of at least 66 late-model jets, and this month Taiwan signed an agreement to buy them by 2026 from American defense contractor Lockheed Martin Corp. It will be Taiwan's first such deal since the U.S. government approved a sale of 150 F-16s in 1992. Downward spiraling relations. The current sale marks the latest development in downward spiraling Sino-US military, political and trade relations. As part of that trend, the U.S. side has buoyed China's old political rival Taiwan since 2017 through arms sales and naval activity aimed at safeguarding the island, which is just 160 kilometers off the Chinese coast. Given everything that has happened between Beijing and Washington, I think the Chinese feel that this is just another measure that the Trump administration has held up of their anti-China trend, said Yun Sun, East Asia Program Senior Associate at the Stimson Center, a research organization in Washington. Beijing sees Taiwan as part of its territory and insists that the two sides eventually unify despite widespread opposition among the Taiwanese people. The dispute goes back to the Chinese Civil War of the 1940s when the nationalists lost to the communists and rebased their government in Taiwan. China, armed with the world's third strongest military, has not ruled out the use of force if needed to take over Taiwan. Separately, the US and China have blocked each other's internet services, shuttered consulates, and, since 2018, been embroiled in a trade dispute. The arms sale is part of that struggle, experts say. Whenever the US and Taiwan do something together, China is obligated to respond, and that response naturally is going to escalate the tension, because that's the action-reaction cycle, Sun said. Military maneuvers. China has stepped up military maneuvers near Taiwan since June. On August 10, the Chinese Air Force briefly sent planes across a median line dividing Taiwan's air defense zone from China's. It had flown over the line at least 8 other times in June. China's People's Liberation Army has held amphibious landing exercises off the south coast of China too, at a time when the U.S. has been frequently conducting provocative military activities near the island of Taiwan, Beijing's state-controlled Global Times news website reported August 9. It anticipated more exercises over the coming weeks. The U.S. should be warned and should not make dangerous moves to avoid misjudgments that neither side would like to see, the Global Times said, citing analysts. U.S. Navy vessels pass all but routinely through the ocean strait separating China from Taiwan, and 2 U.S. aircraft carrier groups sailed into the adjacent South China Sea last month. Taiwan's purchase of the F-16 shows that Washington is determined to keep pressuring China, said Sean King, vice president of the Park Strategies political consultancy in New York. The U.S. military has offered support in recent months for Vietnam and the Philippines as well, as both Southeast Asian countries vie with China over maritime sovereignty. So much frustration. There's just so much frustration in Washington with Beijing right now that nobody in the Trump administration is ready to stand in the way of whatever's good for Taiwan, King said. China has been used to a closer economic relationship with the United States and settling political issues through diplomacy. Its recent behavior may mark a new era in Chinese foreign policy, one that reflects the country's growing strength and ambitions, Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haass writes in an August 13 commentary. However, China can do only so much in reaction to the fighter jet sale and other specific military moves by Washington, analysts say. The U.S. activity reminds China that Washington could protect Taiwan if attacked, Sun said. Communist officials would act, bluntly, against Taiwan only if they had a stronger consensus within their ruling party and freedom from domestic economic issues, including trade issues with the United States, said Alexander Huang, strategic studies professor at Tomkang University in Taiwan. I believe a rational decision-making body or a relatively rational Chinese President, Xi Jinping, would not like to take the risk unless there is an overwhelming challenge from Taiwan, Huang said. Chinese officials have vented less vociferously this time compared to their reactions to previous U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, King said. That could be because Beijing's taking so many hits from Washington at the moment that it's not quite sure which perceived outrage to prioritize, he said. Will the U.S. make clear-cut commitment to defend Taiwan from China? Scenarios worry American strategists like a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Two former high-ranking U.S. officials argue it could happen as early as next year. In an article published this month by the U.S. Naval Institute, USNI, former CIA Deputy Director Michael Morrell and retired U.S. Admiral James Winnefeld described a nightmare scenario for the U.S. military where strategic ambiguity fails to halt a Chinese invasion. For almost 70 years, the United States has never explicitly committed itself to the defense of Taiwan against the Chinese invasion. Now, with U.S.-China relations at a historic low, worries over a Chinese assault on Taiwan are growing, and the fundamental U.S. policy may be changing. An increasing number of military analysts and members of Congress now argue that it is time for the United States to revisit its policy of strategic ambiguity for Taiwan's defense, which for decades has supported billions of dollars in arms sales despite no formal diplomatic relations. Critics of the policy point out that as the region's military balance moves in China's favor, strategic ambiguity is increasingly unsustainable. It might actually make war even more likely, emboldening Xi Jinping and the CCP to undertake military action against the island by deluding themselves into thinking the U.S. might remain on the sidelines. Michael Hunziker, a professor at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government, told VOA in an email. We need to change things on Taiwan to improve the deterrent and make clearer where we stand, especially by ending any remaining ambiguity about how we'd react to the use of force and altering our military force structure and posture, Elbridge Colby, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, wrote in the New York Times early this week. Colby was an author of the Trump administration's National Defense Strategy, which emphasizes competition with China and Russia. Few scenarios worry American strategists like a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Two former high-ranking U.S. officials argue it could happen as early as next year. In an article published this month by the U.S. Naval Institute, USNI, former CIA Deputy Director Michael Morrell and retired U.S. Admiral James Winnefeld described a nightmare scenario for the U.S. military where strategic ambiguity fails to halt a Chinese invasion. Congress leading the call. Taiwan supporters in Congress have largely embraced the Trump administration's approach to the island, including the recent historic visit by Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar and new sales of F-16 jets last week. But some legislators believe the president should do more to have a clear and firm commitment to defend Taiwan. Last month, Florida Representative Ted Yoho said he would introduce a Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act, which would authorize military force if China were to invade Taiwan. The U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan, initially implemented to avoid provoking Beijing to attack Taiwan and encourage peaceful relations, has clearly failed, said Yoho, who is a ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee's Asia Subcommittee. Prior to Yoho's announcement, Senator Josh Hawley introduced the Taiwan Defense Act on June 11, with Representative Mike Gallagher introducing a similar bill in the House on July 1. While the bills do not directly address the question of strategic ambiguity, they do require the Department of Defense to maintain the ability to defeat a Chinese invasion. It's long past time to end strategic ambiguity and draw a clear red line through the Taiwan Strait, Gallagher said in a July 1 press release. Taiwan's liberty is a vital national security interest of the United States, and the Taiwan Defense Act helps ensure our military has the capabilities it needs to block CCP aggression. A core element in U.S.-China relations is the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. While it obligates Washington to provide weapons of a defensive character to Taiwan, it intentionally set forth a vague commitment about Washington's obligation to help Taiwan defend itself. Clarity or ambiguity? A war between the US and China over Taiwan undoubtedly would be a global disaster. War games modeled by US military planners do not always result in American victories against Chinese forces in the region. If passed, the proposed laws could impose serious legal obligations that would demand US action in the case of a Chinese invasion. Some analysts wonder if the US has the resources to meet the obligations. Daniel L. Davis, a foreign policy fellow at Defense Priorities, argued that the U.S. perhaps could eventually repel China's assault on Taiwan. But in addition to the cost to America in lives lost, the U.S. would then have to build a huge military presence on Taiwan to prevent the next Chinese attempt to retake it. Davis, a former lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, wrote in The National Interest this month. As much as the U.S. values and commends freedom for people everywhere, involving ourselves in a war between Taiwan and China could cause catastrophic harm to our country, and might not even ensure Taiwan wins, Davis wrote VOA in an email. Analysts say Americans might fairly ask why Washington should defend island thousands of miles away with seemingly high human and economic costs. So far, opinion polls indicate that the American public remains tepid on this key element in the US-Taiwan relationship. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs, an independent and nonpartisan organization that provides insight on critical global issues, has been asking citizens since 1982 about whether they favor the use of US troops to defend Taiwan. A poll was taken last October by the organization revealed only 35% of Americans would support U.S. military action if the island was attacked. Although the Trump administration has been taking a very strong stand on China in recent months, there have been no moves from the administration to suggest it is preparing to do away with strategic ambiguity. In April 2001, former President George W. Bush said that the United States would do whatever it takes to defend Taiwan. Given the sensitivity of the issue, Bush quickly walked back to this statement hours later. Then Senator Joseph Biden, now the Democratic presidential nominee, criticized Bush weeks later by saying the U.S. has not been obligated to defend Taiwan since Washington abrogated the 1954 Mutual Defense Treaty signed by President Dwight Eisenhower and ratified by the Senate. There is a huge difference between reserving the right to use force and obligating ourselves, a priori, to come to the defense of Taiwan, wrote Biden in a Washington Post opinion piece titled, "Not So Deft on Taiwan." Over the years, China had an opportunity to put the question of whether the American soldiers would fight for Taiwan directly to the U.S. in 1995, right before China fired ballistic missiles near Taiwan's coast. A Chinese military officer raised the question with Joseph Nye, then Assistant Secretary of Defense. "We don't know and you don't know. It would depend on the circumstances," Nye said.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to leave your comments. See you in the next video.